Good evening. Excuse me. Can I say at the outset, first of all, Minister, I'm very grateful to you for coming personally to deal with this matter, because it's a matter of tremendous importance, and we know how topical it is in light of recent demonstrations and demonstration is one word, but it's a very soft word for what's been happening in places like Ashtown. Attacks on people who are from different groups, nationally, ethnically, racially. And the reality is that there is a real risk that we as a country are allowing ourselves to go down a road where racism is becoming normal or somehow quasi-acceptable. And what I want to ask you today is about what we are going to do to tackle that. I want to acknowledge the presence in the public gallery of Emer O'Neill, who's an anti-racism activist, and who has been very vocal as a black Irish woman in talking about her lived experience. And I think for many of us, almost all of us, and I want to note, in fact, the bravery of my colleague, Senator Eileen Flynn, in relation to these kinds of issues as well. But for almost all of us in this chamber, we cannot understand the lived experience of people who look different or come from different backgrounds or who have different ethnicities or races in this society. When they go for a job interview, when they go to any place, it is often, for most of them, immediately obvious that they're different. And the result of that is very often discrimination, even sometimes unconsciously by the person who's carrying out that discrimination. But everything about them, from either the way they look or their name or their background or where they went to college or whatever it might be, can tell an employer or somebody else that they're dealing with that they are a little bit different from a quote, Irish person. And I think that has resulted in a number of instances that I've been told about where people have changed their names, for example. And then they go for an interview, and when they go into the interview for a job, the employer realises that they're not, in fact, and Emer is maybe a case in point, Emer O'Neill sounds like an ordinary Irish person. She is mixed race. She goes into an interview, she's different at what the interviewer is expecting. And that can have a knock-on effect for that person. And that's what we're talking about when we talk about lived experience. And the fact that I certainly cannot understand what that is. But the reality is it has a huge impact on individuals, but it also has an impact across society. And one of the major issues is that it forces people to kind of to change who they are and what they have been and where they have come from, which is a real shame, because one of the great benefits of the cultural diversity is that it enhances our society. It makes us stronger as a nation, as a community. It renders this place a nicer place to live if we are not totally homogenous in terms of the makeup of our society. And the other danger that comes with that is that if we let the message go out there to our young people that somehow diversity is a bad thing, or that somehow people of colour or people who are ethnically or racially different don't occupy positions of power or leadership, then they don't learn that that is a normal thing. They don't learn that it's perfectly normal to have people who are different from us in roles that involve leadership and power. And for example, those people who go to America or Britain, for young people who go for jobs and find themselves in a situation where their manager or their boss or whoever it is ethnically different, they somehow don't understand how they're going to deal with that person. So we're doing a disservice to our young people if we don't deal with this. So Minister, in terms of what your department needs to do, and I know that you are strong on the issue of integration, but we know that there is also an anti-racism action plan. I understand it's ready to go, and yet we haven't seen it. And it has never been more urgent than it is today. When we saw what happened in Ashtown, even in the last week, it has never been as urgent as it is now. So if I can start by asking you where the anti-racism action plan is, and secondly, what it is that your department is going to put in place to help us all understand the dangers and the harm that racism does, but also to help those who are subjected to racial or ethnic abuse. What are we doing to support them, to show them that they're welcome, to show them that the government supports them, and to put in place measures to make sure they know that they have everyone's support, not just a small number of people?
Thank you, Senator. Can I also welcome Ms O'Neill to the public gallery and compliment her on the great work she does. Minister, you have 4 minutes to reply.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank the Senator for raising this really important issue today. I did want the opportunity to speak to it myself. I'll come back maybe in the follow-up at the end to some of the recent incidents, but I think we know that over the last 12 months we've seen the largest humanitarian effort in the history of the state, and since the start of last year, over 85,000 people have arrived in Ireland fleeing war and persecution, and in these very difficult circumstances, Ireland has provided shelter, and security. And I think this is something we can be very proud of as a country. And yet there is very clear evidence that racism exists in our country, and we know there are some people who feel its impact in their day-to-day lives. And the government has responded to this unprecedented humanitarian crisis in a number of ways over the past few years, over the past year. And there's also a number of existing programmes to empower communities, funding anti-racism and integration activities throughout the state. I think it is important to say that the response to racism is a statewide response. It's a country-wide response, and no one department will have, I suppose, the monopoly in terms of the response. But in terms of the actions that are taking place within my own department, we have a range of funding streams in place to support locally organised diversity and equality projects. So we have the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, the Communities Integration Fund, the National Integration Fund and the European Social Fund. And then in more explicit, specific areas, we provide funding to gender equality groups and to Traveller and Roma organisations to organise local diversity and equality events. So there is a wide range of funding mechanisms to support primarily local responses, recognising that it's also often those local conversations that are the most effective in tackling racism. In terms of your question on the National Action Plan, in 2020, the government established the Independent Anti-Racism Committee with a view to strengthening the government's approach to combating individual and institutional racism and build on existing strategies. And that was part of Ireland's response to an UN global call to tackle racism. There was very extensive public engagement, very extensive consultation undertaken by the Anti-Racism Committee across 2021 and 2022. The committee has submitted their final report to my department, and myself and Minister Joe O'Brien intend to bring the National Action Plan Against Racism to Cabinet imminently, and our plan is, and I spoke about this at the UN last week, to launch it in early March. I think this is a really important step. This will be our first detailed national action plan against racism since 2008. So this has been a gap in our state's response to the issue of racism, and a gap that will be filled rapidly. Just in terms of some other responses on the criminal law side, which I think are also important as well, as you know, Senator, the Criminal Justice Incitement to Violence or Hatred and Hate Offences Bill is currently before the Oireachtas. It's going to update laws on criminalising hate speech and legislating against hate crimes for the first time in Irish law. And although hate speech is currently an offence, as we know, the legislation is very complex and hasn't really delivered in a meaningful way. And the new legislation will enable prosecution of offences which are motivated by prejudice against protected characteristics, including race, nationality or ethnic origin. And obviously we know a lot of the recent rhetoric has been focused on migrants. We do have a migrant integration strategy, and that works to promote social cohesion across the state, and there are mechanisms within that for the state, for government departments and state agencies to support migrants and support their wider integration in society. So as I said earlier on, financial supports are important, but it is supporting community, it is supporting on-the-ground engagement with people who may have heard incorrect rumours, who may have heard lies, and I suppose demonstrating to them that they are falsehoods. That's often the most effective way to tackle some of the incidents we've seen recently.
Thank you, Minister. Senator, you have 1 minute for a supplementary follow-up.
Minister, thanks very much. I appreciate what you said, and I acknowledge the work that your department has done in terms of integration and accommodating people who have come here fleeing situations. I also recognise what you said about funds, and that you've said that it's not any one department's responsibility. Of course that's true, but I'm wondering, as I look at, for example, students from Loreto Doki in the public gallery here, what are we doing to educate children? What are we doing in terms of the National Anti-Racism Action Plan, which I appreciate is coming to Cabinet now, and that is great, but what in that is going to provide for education for people, so that we start at the very beginning to show people that, you know, where things lie? Because the real danger is that as things stand, we look at what happened in Ashtown, for example, that we are allowing a them and us situation to evolve, where Irish people, Maria, are being pitched against people who are not Irish. And that's really dangerous and really damaging. And the thing that many of us don't understand is sometimes people who are ethnically different are accused of playing the race card, as it's called. They never want to do that. They just want to live their lives. They just want to be part of our community. And if we had any sense, we'd realise that we have enormous benefit from their being part of this community. So let's do everything we can to make sure they can play that role.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks.
Minister, one minute.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Senator. And I think it's important that we, call out these recent incidents. People are entitled to protest. People are entitled to have a different view to government. That's absolutely fair, and that happens. But I think it's really important to call out a number of recent incidents. You've made reference to an attack on migrants in Ashtown, an attack fuelled by lies put on social media that someone had been the victim of an assault. We've seen in recent days a building in Dublin set on fire, again as a result of lies put around by far-right groups. There is a deep and disturbing strand of racism behind a number of these incidents. And I think we have to be very explicit about that. And it's worrying. It requires an all-of-government response. It requires parties across the Oireachtas to respond. And I want to recognise in my engagement with government and opposition, a lot of people are showing leadership in their local communities and at some risk to themselves because, again, politicians across the spectrum in recent weeks have had their houses picketed, their offices picketed. So I just want to recognise there is leadership across the spectrum, but it needs to continue. Thanks, Senator.
Thank you, Minister.